"You're greedy," my daughter-in-law said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the clink of silverware and the quiet hum of the dining room. And for a moment, no one at the table moved, not even my son, who simply lowered his eyes to his plate as if the words had nothing to do with me, as if I were just another piece of furniture in the house I had helped build. I remember the way the chandelier light reflected off the polished wood table, the same table my husband and I had picked out 32 years ago when this house was still just a blueprint and a dream, and how strange it felt that something so familiar could suddenly feel so cold. I didn't respond, not because I didn't hear her, but because I did, every syllable of it, and I understood immediately that this wasn't just a careless remark, it was a line being drawn, one I hadn't realized we had been approaching for months. Daniel cleared his throat softly, the way he used to when he was a boy trying to avoid trouble, but he didn't look at me, didn't say my name, didn't correct her, and that silence spoke louder than anything Ashley could have said. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, smoothing it out with hands that had once held my husband's as we signed the final papers for the building downtown, the one he left to me, the one that now seemed to sit like a wedge between me and the only family I had left. Ashley leaned back in her chair, her expression calm, almost satisfied, as if she had finally said something she'd been holding in for a long time, and maybe she had, because when I looked at her, I realized this wasn't anger, it was certainty. "It's just a building," Daniel muttered, still not meeting my eyes, but his words sounded rehearsed, like something he had already agreed to before this dinner even began. Just a building. I thought about the years my husband spent working late nights, the weekends he sacrificed, the way we celebrated when the first tenant signed a lease, how we stood across the street once, hand in hand, looking up at it like it was proof that everything we had endured together had meant something. And now, to them, it was just a building. I reached for my glass of water, noticing how steady my hand was despite the weight pressing against my chest, and I took a small sip, letting the silence stretch just a second longer than it should have. "I see," I said finally, my voice even, almost gentle, and that seemed to unsettle Ashley more than if I had raised it, because she shifted slightly in her seat, her confidence flickering for just a moment. Outside, a car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating the window behind them, and for a second, I caught my reflection in the glass, an older woman with silver hair and a calm expression, someone who looked far more composed than she felt. I had spent decades keeping this family together, smoothing over disagreements, making sure every holiday felt warm and complete, believing that love was something you built slowly, carefully, like the life my husband and I had created from nothing. But sitting there, across from the two people who were supposed to be my closest family, I realized something had shifted long before tonight, something quiet and deliberate that I had chosen not to see. Ashley picked up her fork again, as if the conversation was already over, as if her words had settled everything, and Daniel followed her lead, the two of them moving on with their meal like nothing had changed. But everything had. I set my glass down and glanced once more at the empty chair at the head of the table, the one my husband used to sit in, the one that had remained untouched since the day we buried him. And for the first time, I understood that his absence hadn't just left a void. It had created an opportunity, one that someone had been quietly preparing to take advantage of. And as I sat there in that silence, I made a decision just as quietly, just as carefully, letting them believe, for now, that I was exactly who they thought I was. The house felt different the next morning, not louder or quieter, but emptier in a way that settled into the walls, as if something invisible had shifted overnight and left behind a space that could not be filled. And I noticed it first in the kitchen when I reached for the coffee pot and realized I had poured 2 cups out of habit, one for myself and one for a man who had been gone for 6 weeks, a habit I had not yet learned to break, or perhaps had not wanted to. I stood there for a moment, staring at the second cup as the steam rose slowly into the early morning light, and then I poured it down the sink without a word, watching it disappear as quietly as everything else seemed to be disappearing lately. Outside, the street was calm, the same as it had always been, neighbors walking their dogs, a delivery truck stopping 2 houses down, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing without hesitation, and it struck me how little the world changes when your own does. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in the armchair by the window, the one Robert used to call my thinking chair, and I allowed myself, just for a moment, to look at the building across my mind the way I used to look at it in real life, standing tall on Maple Avenue, for stories of brick and glass that had once felt like a shared victory, something solid and undeniable that proved we had built something lasting together. Robert used to say that building was not just an investment, it was security, something that would take care of me long after he was gone, and I had believed him because he had never given me a reason not to. I remembered the afternoon he first showed me the listing, how we sat at this very table with papers spread out between us, calculating numbers, talking through risks, laughing when the totals did not quite add up at first, and how we made it work anyway, step by careful step, until the day we signed the final documents and walked out into the sunlight feeling like we had claimed a piece of the future. That memory had always been warm, something I could return to when things felt uncertain, but now it carried a different weight, because somewhere along the way, that future had been quietly rewritten without me. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue, and I replayed the dinner from the night before, not the words themselves but the spaces between them, the way Ashley had spoken with certainty instead of anger, the way Daniel had avoided my eyes, the way neither of them seemed surprised by what had been said, and it became clear to me that this had not been a sudden outburst. It had been a conclusion they had already reached. I set the cup down carefully on the side table and reached for the small stack of mail I had left unopened the day before, flipping through envelopes that suddenly felt heavier than they should have, utility bills, advertisements, and then one from the property management office for the building. The return address printed neatly in the corner, something I had seen dozens of times before without giving it a second thought. I opened it slowly, sliding the paper out and smoothing it flat against my knee, and as my eyes moved across the lines, I felt a small, precise shift in my chest. Not panic, not even surprise, but something quieter, something colder, because the numbers were different than I expected, the payment allocations unfamiliar, and there were notes at the bottom referencing changes that I did not remember authorizing. I read it again, more carefully this time, tracing each line as if I might find an explanation hidden between the words. But there was nothing there except the unmistakable feeling that something had been handled without my knowledge. I leaned back in the chair and let out a slow breath, my gaze drifting toward the window where the morning light had grown stronger, illuminating the dust motes in the air like tiny fragments suspended in place. And I thought about how easily things can be moved, adjusted, redirected when you trust the people around you not to do so. For years, I had let Daniel handle certain details, small things at first, paperwork here and there, decisions that seemed practical at the time, especially after Robert passed, and everything felt too heavy to carry alone, and Ashley had always been nearby, offering help in that polished, effortless way of hers, stepping in just enough to make herself useful, without ever appearing to take control. I closed my eyes briefly, not in distress, but in clarity, because the pattern was no longer difficult to see. It was laid out plainly now, each small decision leading to the next until the ground beneath me had been quietly reshaped. When I opened my eyes again, the room looked the same as it had before, the same furniture, the same photographs, the same quiet stillness, but I was no longer looking at it the same way, and I understood then that whatever had begun before last night had not ended with a single word spoken across a dinner table. It had only revealed itself, and now that I could see it, I would not pretend otherwise. I drove to the building that afternoon, not because I had planned to, but because something inside me no longer felt comfortable relying on secondhand information, and as I pulled into the small parking lot behind the structure, I noticed how familiar everything looked and yet how distant it suddenly felt, as if I were arriving at a place I had once known well, but had not truly seen in years. The brick exterior was the same warm shade it had always been, the windows reflecting the pale sky above, and for a moment I sat in the car with the engine off, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as I gathered my thoughts, reminding myself that this was not just a property or an investment. It was something my husband and I had built together, something that carried our effort, our decisions, and our shared belief in a stable future. When I stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished floors and faint air freshener greeted me, and I was struck by how routine everything appeared, tenants moving in and out, someone checking their mail, the quiet hum of a building that continued to function regardless of who owned it on paper. I made my way to the small office near the front where the property manager, Mr. Harris, had worked for the past 8 years, a man Robert had trusted and one I had always considered reliable. And when he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, there was a brief pause in his expression, subtle but noticeable, like a flicker of surprise he could not quite hide. "Mrs. Collins," he said, standing quickly, smoothing his tie in a way that felt more nervous than polite. "I was not expecting you today." I offered a small, composed smile and stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me. "I thought I would stop by and review a few things myself," I said, keeping my tone even, almost casual, as if this were nothing more than a routine visit. He nodded, though his movements were slightly delayed, and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Of course, everything is running smoothly." I sat down, placing my handbag neatly in my lap, and looked at him steadily, not with accusation, but with quiet attention, the kind that invites truth without demanding it. "I received your statement this morning," I said, watching carefully as his eyes shifted for just a fraction of a second, "and I noticed a few changes I do not recall approving." He cleared his throat and reached for a folder on his desk, flipping it open with hands that were just slightly less steady than usual. "Yes, there have been some updates recently, mostly administrative, nothing significant," he replied, but his voice carried a tone that did not quite match his words. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze steady. "I would like to see the authorization documents for those changes," I said, not raising my voice, not adding pressure, simply stating what I needed as if it were the most natural request in the world. He hesitated, only for a moment, but long enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect, before turning to his filing cabinet and pulling out a set of papers, placing them carefully on the desk between us. I reached for the documents and began to read, line by line, my eyes moving slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail, every signature, every date. And it did not take long to find what I was looking for, because there it was, clear and unmistakable, a signature authorizing changes to the account structure, a name written in confident, flowing script that was not mine. I did not react immediately, did not allow the discovery to show on my face. Instead, I continued reading as if nothing had changed, turning the page with calm, measured movements, giving myself the time to fully understand what I was seeing rather than simply reacting to it. When I finally looked up, I met Mr. Harris's eyes, and this time he did not look away as quickly, as if he understood that whatever uncertainty had existed before was now gone. "When were these changes made?" I asked quietly, my tone still even, still controlled. He glanced down at the documents, then back at me, and answered with a careful precision that suggested he had rehearsed this moment in his mind. "Approximately 3 months ago, Mrs. Collins." 3 months. I nodded slightly, absorbing the timeline, placing it alongside everything else I had begun to notice, the subtle shifts, the growing distance, the quiet decisions being made without my knowledge. "And who provided this authorization?" I continued, though the answer was already in front of me. He hesitated again, then said, "Your daughter-in-law, Ashley Collins, indicated she was acting on behalf of the family." The room remained still for a moment, the kind of stillness that follows when something unspoken becomes undeniable, and I felt a clarity settle over me, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady and certain, like a line drawn in place that would not move again. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the desk, my movements calm, my expression unchanged, and I offered a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Harris, that is all I needed to know," I said, standing slowly, gathering my handbag without haste. As I walked toward the door, I paused for just a moment, my hand resting lightly on the handle, and I allowed myself one final glance at the office, at the place that had once represented security and trust, and I realized that nothing here had changed on its own. It had been changed by someone who believed I would not notice, or worse, that I would not respond. I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, the quiet hum of the building surrounding me once again, and as I made my way toward the exit, I felt no anger, no rush of emotion, only a calm, deliberate understanding that what had been taken quietly would need to be addressed just as quietly, and that the conversation at the dinner table had not been the beginning of this, but it would not be the end either. I did not go home right away after leaving the building. Instead, I drove slowly through the familiar streets, past places that had once been part of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. and I found myself pulling into the small parking lot beside the old diner Robert and I used to visit on Sunday mornings, a place where nothing ever seemed to change, where the coffee was always strong and the booth still carried the faint scent of syrup and thyme. I sat there for a while before going in, my hands resting in my lap, not out of hesitation, but because I was allowing my thoughts to settle into something clearer, something more structured than the quiet realization that had followed me out of that office. When I finally stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly, and I chose a booth near the window, sliding into the seat across from an empty space that instinctively felt like it should have been occupied, just as it had been for so many years before. The waitress brought me coffee without asking, recognizing me in the way small-town routines tend to preserve memory, and I thanked her with a small nod, wrapping my hands around the warm mug as I stared out at the street beyond the glass. It was there, in that stillness, that the past began to arrange itself differently in my mind, not as scattered memories, but as a sequence I could finally follow without resistance. I thought about the months before Robert passed, how he had insisted on reviewing every document personally, even when it tired him, even when I told him he could rest, and how he had repeated more than once, with quiet certainty, that everything was in order, that I would not have to worry, that the building was secure and fully under my name. At the time, I had accepted those words with trust, the kind that comes from decades of shared decisions. But now I could see the small moments that followed after his passing, moments I had dismissed because grief has a way of softening your attention to detail. Ashley offering to help organize paperwork so I would not feel overwhelmed, Daniel suggesting that it would be easier if they handled certain communications on my behalf, small conveniences that felt reasonable at the time, even thoughtful, because I was tired and the house was too quiet, and every task seemed heavier than it should have been. I remembered the afternoon Ashley sat at the dining table with a stack of folders, her tone gentle, her movements efficient, explaining that there were a few routine updates that needed to be addressed, nothing complicated, just standard adjustments to ensure everything ran smoothly. And I had signed where she indicated without asking too many questions, trusting the calm confidence in her voice more than my own hesitation. At the time, it had felt like help, like support, like the kind of care family offers when you are not at your strongest. But sitting there now, with the memory unfolding in a different light, I could see how precise those moments had been, how carefully they had been timed, how naturally each step had led to the next without ever feeling forced. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle, and I realized that nothing had been taken in a single act. Nothing had been forced or rushed. It had been a series of quiet permissions, small openings I had allowed without recognizing their direction, and that understanding did not bring anger so much as it brought clarity. Across the street, a couple walked past the window, talking and laughing in a way that reminded me of a version of life that felt distant now, and I watched them for a moment before lowering my gaze back to the table, where my reflection faintly appeared in the dark surface of the coffee. I looked at myself not as I had been, but as I was now, someone who had finally seen the full shape of what had been happening around her, and I understood that whatever came next could not be built on assumption or trust alone. It would require attention, patience, and a willingness to move just as carefully as the steps that had led me here. I finished my coffee slowly, placing the cup back on the table with a quiet sense of finality, and as I reached for my handbag, I felt a calm settle over me that was different from before, not the calm of not knowing, but the calm of knowing exactly where I stood and what had been done, and more importantly, what had not yet been undone. When I stepped back outside, the air felt cooler, the lights slightly sharper, and I walked to my car without hesitation, already aware that the next steps would not require confrontation or raised voices, only precision, because the kind of change that had been made quietly would need to be addressed in the same way, and this time, I would be the one deciding how each step unfolded. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already begun arranging the steps ahead before I even opened my eyes, and I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, a quiet that no longer felt empty but observant, as if it were waiting to see what I would do next. I rose slowly, moving through my routine with the same deliberate calm I had carried since the previous day, making coffee, opening the curtains, allowing the soft morning light to settle into the room, and I noticed how steady everything felt when I did not rush, when I did not allow emotion to lead me before understanding had fully taken its place. After breakfast, I walked into Robert's study, a room I had not entered often since he passed, not out of avoidance, but because it still held too much of him. His presence lingering in the neatly arranged books, the framed certificates, the faint scent of his cologne that had somehow remained, subtle but unmistakable. I paused at the doorway for just a second before stepping inside, closing the door gently behind me, as if I were entering a space that required intention rather than habit. His desk was exactly as he had left it, organized, precise, every item placed with care, and I sat down in his chair, letting my hands rest lightly on the surface as I took in the quiet order of the room, reminding myself that this had always been where decisions were made, not hurried ones, but careful, considered ones. I opened the top drawer and began to go through the folders he had kept, not searching randomly, but following the logic I knew he used: financial records grouped by year, property documents separated by type, everything labeled in his familiar handwriting. And it did not take long before I found the file related to the building, thicker than the others, its edges slightly worn from years of being reviewed and updated. I placed it on the desk and opened it slowly, turning each page with attention, allowing myself to read not just for information, but for understanding, tracing the structure he had built into these documents, the safeguards he had put in place, the way he had anticipated the future with a level of care I had perhaps taken for granted at the time. As I read, I began to see something that had not been visible before, not because it had been hidden, but because I had not been looking for it. A clause, carefully written, that outlined conditions under which authority over the property could be temporarily delegated, but only under specific circumstances, with clear limitations, and always with the expectation that final control remained with me unless explicitly transferred through a separate, formal process. I sat back slightly, the paper still in my hands, and let that detail settle into place alongside everything else I had learned, because it meant that whatever had been done recently had not been done through a complete transfer of ownership, but through a manipulation of access, a temporary opening that had been extended and reshaped without my full awareness. I closed the file gently and placed it back on the desk, my fingers resting on the cover for a moment as I considered the difference between losing something and having something adjusted just enough that it appears to no longer belong to you, even when, in truth, it still does. The distinction was important, not just legally, but strategically, because it meant that what had been done could be reversed, not through confrontation, but through precision, through the same quiet attention that had allowed it to happen in the first place. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where the trees moved slightly in the morning breeze, and I thought about how easily trust can be redirected when it is offered without question, and how rarely people expect that it will be examined once it has been given. But that had changed now, not because I had become someone different, but because I had finally chosen to see clearly what had been placed in front of me all along. I returned to the desk and reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in some time. A man Robert had worked with for years, someone who understood not just the numbers but the structure behind them, someone who valued accuracy over convenience. I paused for a brief moment before pressing the call button, not out of uncertainty, but because I understood that this was the point where observation would begin to turn into action, and when he answered, his voice steady and familiar, I spoke with the same calm clarity I had carried since the previous evening, explaining that I needed a full review of the property records, every document, every authorization, every change that had been made in the past 6 months, and I did not need to raise my voice or add urgency, because the precision of the request carried its own weight. When I ended the call, I set the phone down and allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not of relief, but of alignment, because for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was preparing to understand it fully, and once something is understood completely, it is no longer something that can be taken quietly without consequence. 2 days passed without a word from Daniel or Ashley, and I did not reach out to them either, not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because I understood now that timing mattered more than urgency, and there was nothing to be gained from speaking before I had all the pieces in place. The house remained quiet, but it no longer felt like a space filled with absence. It felt like a space where something was being prepared, each moment settling into a deliberate rhythm that I had not recognized before. On the third morning, my phone rang just after 9 o'clock, the sound cutting cleanly through the stillness, and when I saw the name on the screen, I answered without hesitation. Margaret, the voice said, steady and professional, the same voice that had once walked Robert and me through our most important decisions. I have gone through everything you asked for. I moved to the window as I listened, my gaze resting on the quiet street outside, allowing his words to unfold without interruption. There have been multiple adjustments made to the management structure of the property, he continued, none of which transfer ownership, but they do alter control, access, and distribution in ways that would benefit anyone positioned to act on your behalf. I did not respond immediately, not because I was surprised, but because I was allowing each detail to settle fully before moving to the next. And were these changes authorized properly? I asked, my tone even measured. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, the kind that suggests careful wording, rather than uncertainty. They were authorized, he said, but not in a way that reflects full transparency. The documents indicate that your daughter-in-law acted under assumed consent, using prior permissions that appear to have been extended beyond their original scope. I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because that was exactly how it had been done, not by force, not by deception that could be easily exposed, but by stepping just slightly beyond what had been allowed, again and again, until the line itself became unclear. Can it be reversed? I asked. Yes, he replied without hesitation, but it will require precise action. The structure is still intact. It has not been transferred, only adjusted. That is important. I nodded, though he could not see me, because I understood the weight of that distinction now more than ever. I will prepare everything you need, he continued, but I would advise that you do not confront them yet. Let them continue as they are. It will make the correction cleaner. Cleaner. The word lingered for a moment, and I found myself appreciating the simplicity of it, because that was exactly what I intended. Not conflict, not explanation, just correction. After I ended the call, I remained by the window for a few moments longer, watching as a car passed slowly down the street, its movement steady, predictable, and I thought about how easily patterns form when they are not interrupted, how people begin to believe in their own assumptions when nothing challenges them. Ashley believed she was in control. Daniel believed things had been arranged in a way that made sense for their future, and for now, there was no reason for them to think otherwise. I turned from the window and walked back into the study, the same room where I had sat the day before, and I opened the file once more, not because I needed to read it again, but because I wanted to see it with the understanding I now had, to confirm that everything aligned the way it should. The documents looked different now, not in content, but in meaning, each clause, each signature, each condition forming a structure that had not been broken, only bent, and anything that can be bent can be returned to its original position with the right amount of care. I closed the file and placed it back in the drawer, my movements unhurried, and I felt a quiet certainty settle into place, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real. That evening, Daniel called, his voice casual, almost too casual, asking if I would be joining them for dinner the following night, and I agreed without hesitation, my answer simple, my tone unchanged. Of course, I said, as if nothing had shifted, as if everything remained exactly as it had been before. After I hung up, I placed the phone down gently and allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity, because I understood now that the next time we sat at that table, it would not be the same conversation, even if they believed it would be, and sometimes the most effective response is not the one that interrupts the moment, but the one that waits for it to repeat. I arrived at their house the next evening exactly on time, not early and not late, carrying nothing with me except the same calm composure I had practiced over the past few days, and when Ashley opened the door, her smile appeared immediately, polished and effortless, the kind that suggested everything was exactly as it should be, as if the last dinner had never happened or had already been resolved in her mind without my participation. "Margaret, come in," she said warmly, stepping aside to let me pass, and I returned the same level of politeness, offering a small smile as I entered, taking in the familiar layout of the home that had once felt like an extension of my own, but now felt like a place I was visiting rather than belonging to. Daniel was already in the dining room, adjusting something on the table, and when he saw me, he straightened slightly, his expression softening into something that might have been relief, though it was difficult to tell whether it was genuine or simply the comfort of routine re-establishing itself. "Mom, I am glad you could make it," he said, his tone careful, as if testing the ground between us, and I nodded, placing my handbag neatly on the chair before taking my seat without hesitation. The table was set beautifully, more carefully than usual, which did not escape my notice, and I observed the details quietly, the folded napkins, the polished glasses, the way Ashley moved around the room with practiced ease, creating an atmosphere that suggested harmony rather than tension. Dinner began with light conversation, the kind that fills space without touching anything important, updates about work, a mention of the weather, a brief comment about a neighbor, and I participated just enough to maintain the rhythm, answering when spoken to, offering small acknowledgments, allowing them to settle into the belief that whatever discomfort had existed before had already passed. Ashley watched me closely, though she tried to disguise it within her usual manner, and I could see the subtle way she evaluated my tone, my posture, my reactions, as if searching for any sign that I had changed, any indication that her position was not as secure as she believed it to be. But I gave her nothing, not because I was hiding something, but because there was nothing to show yet, nothing that needed to be revealed before its time. Halfway through the meal, Daniel cleared his throat and leaned slightly forward, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "We have been thinking about the building," he said, his words measured, as if carefully chosen in advance, and I looked at him calmly, giving him my full attention without interrupting. "It might be easier if we made a few more adjustments," he continued, glancing briefly at Ashley before returning his gaze to me, "just to streamline everything moving forward." I nodded slowly, as if considering his suggestion for the first time, even though I already understood exactly what he was referring to, and I allowed a small pause before responding. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked, my voice neutral, open, inviting explanation rather than resistance. Ashley set her fork down gently and leaned in slightly, her expression composed, confident. "Nothing major," she said, her tone smooth. "Just a few updates to make things more efficient, especially with taxes and management. It would really take a lot of pressure off you." I held her gaze for a moment, not challenging, not agreeing, simply observing, and then I offered a faint smile, the kind that suggests acceptance without commitment. "That sounds reasonable," I said quietly, and I saw the brief flicker of satisfaction in her eyes before she quickly masked it again. The conversation moved on, returning to safer topics, and I continued to listen, to respond when appropriate, to remain exactly as they expected me to be, because expectation is a powerful thing, and once people settle into it, they rarely question it unless given a reason to do so. When dinner ended, Ashley brought out dessert, something simple but carefully prepared, and as she placed the plate in front of me, she said lightly, "I am glad we can all move forward. It is important to keep things practical," and I nodded once more, lifting my fork as if nothing about that statement required further thought. But inside, I understood exactly what she meant, not in her words, but in her assumption, the belief that the situation had already been decided, that the direction was set, and that all that remained was for me to follow along. I finished the dessert slowly, setting the fork down with the same quiet precision I had carried through the entire evening, and when I finally stood to leave, Daniel walked me to the door, his expression softer now, more relaxed, as if something had been resolved simply because I had not objected. "We will talk more soon," he said, and I placed my hand lightly on his arm, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "We will." And as I stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze brushing lightly against my face, I knew that nothing they believed about this situation was accurate anymore, and that the next time we spoke, it would not be about adjustments, but about correction, and by then, there would be nothing left for them to assume. 3 days later, everything was ready, not in the sense of confrontation or announcement, but in the quiet, structured way that Robert had always believed was the only way anything lasting should be handled. And that morning I dressed as I normally would, choosing a simple navy outfit, nothing that suggested anything unusual, nothing that would draw attention away from what was about to unfold. I arrived at the law office 10 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because I preferred to be settled before anything began, and when I stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and paper greeted me, steady and professional, a place where things were documented, confirmed, and made real in a way that could not be undone by assumption or tone. A voice. Daniel and Ashley arrived a few minutes later, their expressions composed, though I noticed the brief glance Ashley gave the receptionist, the quick scan of the room as if assessing whether this setting aligned with what she had expected, and I could see that it did not entirely, though she masked it quickly with the same controlled confidence she had shown before. "Margaret, you did not mention we were meeting here," she said lightly as they approached, her tone smooth, almost amused, as if this were a small deviation rather than a deliberate choice, and I returned her gaze with a calm expression. "I thought it would be easier to review everything properly," I replied, my voice even, offering no further explanation because none was needed. We were led into a conference room where the documents had already been arranged neatly on the table, each folder placed with precision, and as we took our seats, I noticed how Ashley's posture remained relaxed, her hands resting lightly in front of her, while Daniel's shoulders carried a slight tension, as if something about the setting made him less certain than before. The attorney entered shortly after, greeting us politely before taking his place at the head of the table, and without unnecessary introduction, he began, his tone clear and measured. "We are here to review the current structure of the Maple Avenue property and address several recent changes that have been identified." Ashley leaned back slightly, her expression attentive but untroubled, as if she believed this would simply confirm what she already considered to be in order, and Daniel nodded faintly, his gaze moving between the documents and the attorney, waiting. The first folder was opened, and the attorney walked through the existing ownership structure, outlining what had been established originally, the clarity of it, the simplicity, the way it had been designed to ensure stability, and I watched as Ashley listened, her expression unchanged, because none of this contradicted her understanding yet. Then the second folder was opened, and the tone shifted, not dramatically, but enough to alter the room, as the attorney began to outline the modifications that had been made, the adjustments to management authority, the changes in access, the way permissions had been extended beyond their intended scope. Ashley's posture remained steady, but I noticed the slight tightening of her fingers, the almost imperceptible pause before. She reached for the document in front of her, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as he followed along. "These changes were authorized under prior consent," the attorney continued. "However, they do not reflect a full transfer of ownership and do not override the original structure." And there was a brief silence that followed, not long, but enough to allow the meaning to settle. Ashley spoke first, her tone still controlled, though now more deliberate. "But these adjustments were made to improve efficiency. Everything was done properly," she said, her words carefully chosen, and the attorney nodded slightly, acknowledging her statement without confirming it. "They were processed," he replied. "But processing does not equate to permanence, especially when the authority used to initiate them does not extend as far as it was applied." Daniel looked at Ashley then, a small shift, but one that had not occurred before, and I remained still, my hands resting calmly on the table, allowing the conversation to move without interruption. The final folder was opened, and the attorney placed a document in front of me, then one in front of Daniel, and finally one in front of Ashley. "This outlines the necessary steps to restore the original structure and remove any unauthorized extensions of control," he said, his tone steady, factual, leaving no room for interpretation. Ashley's eyes moved quickly across the page, her expression tightening just slightly, the confidence she had carried now meeting something it had not accounted for, and Daniel's gaze shifted again, this time more noticeably, as he read. I did not speak immediately, did not look at either of them. Instead, I reviewed the document in front of me once more, not because I needed to, but because I understood the importance of the moment being handled without haste. When I finally set the paper down, I lifted my gaze and met Ashley's eyes, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a calm clarity that did not require explanation, and in that moment, I saw the first real sign that her certainty had been interrupted. "We will proceed with the correction," I said quietly, my voice steady. Final. And the room remained still for just a second longer, as if everything that had been assumed before had been quietly, precisely undone. The room remained quiet after my words settled, not tense in the way arguments tend to be, but still in a way that suggested something had shifted beyond repair, and I noticed how Ashley's posture changed first, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the confidence she had carried into the room no longer rested as comfortably as it had before, her shoulders slightly drawn in, her expression more controlled than composed, as if she were now measuring each reaction instead of relying on certainty. Daniel sat beside her, his gaze moving between the documents and my face, and for the first time since this had begun, there was no clear direction in his expression, no alignment to follow, only a quiet uncertainty that had replaced the easy agreement he had shown at the dinner table. The attorney continued speaking, outlining the next procedural steps, the signatures required, the timeline for restoring the original structure, but I allowed his voice to become background for a moment as I observed the two people across from me, not with judgment, but with a kind of clarity that only comes when something has fully revealed itself. Ashley finally spoke, her voice steady, though now more deliberate than confident. I was only trying to help, she said, her words careful, as if they had been selected to sound reasonable rather than defensive, and I looked at her, not interrupting, not dismissing, simply allowing the statement to exist without needing to challenge it directly. I understand, I replied calmly, and my response seemed to unsettle her more than disagreement would have, because there was nothing in it for her to push against, no conflict to redirect, only a quiet acknowledgement that did not change what had already been established. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his hand moving to the edge of the table as if he were grounding himself, and when he spoke, his voice carried a hesitation that had not been there before. "Mom, we thought this was the best way to manage things," he said, not looking directly at me at first, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of the belief behind his words. "I know," I said softly, and then I let a brief pause settle before continuing. "But believing something is the best way does not make it the right one." The simplicity of that statement seemed to land more heavily than anything else that had been said, and Daniel finally looked at me, really looked at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in a long while, not as someone who would quietly accept what was decided for her, but as someone who had allowed things to unfold only until they were fully understood. The attorney placed the final document in front of me, indicating where I needed to sign, and I picked up the pen without hesitation, my hand steady, my movements precise, because there was nothing uncertain about this moment, nothing left to consider or question. I signed my name carefully, exactly as I had done years ago when Robert and I first secured what we had built, and as I placed the pen back on the table, I felt a quiet sense of completion, not of victory, but of alignment, as if something that had been shifted out of place had now been returned to where it belonged. The remaining signatures were handled with less certainty, Daniel taking a moment longer than usual before adding his name, Ashley following with a controlled expression that did not fully conceal the realization settling beneath it. And once everything was finalized, the attorney gathered the documents, confirming that the corrections would take effect immediately, restoring the structure exactly as it had been intended. I stood slowly, smoothing my jacket as I did, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been addressed without needing to be repeated. Ashley remained seated, her gaze lowered briefly to the table before lifting again, and I could see that the certainty she had relied on was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more aware, though not necessarily more understanding. Daniel stood as well, stepping slightly closer to me, his expression uncertain, as if he were searching for the right words but finding none that felt sufficient, and I placed my hand lightly on his arm, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement, a simple gesture that did not erase what had happened but did not need to deepen it either. "Take care of yourself," I said gently, my voice steady, and then I turned toward the door without waiting for a response, because there was nothing else required of me in that room. As I stepped outside, the air felt clear, the light steady, and I paused for just a moment on the sidewalk, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because I understood that what had been corrected was not just a matter of documents or ownership. It was a matter of position, of clarity, of knowing exactly where I stood and choosing not to step away from it again. I walked toward my car with the same calm pace I had carried throughout the past few days, and as I reached for the door handle, I allowed myself one final thought, simple and certain, not shaped by anger or regret, but by understanding that I had never been greedy. I had simply been patient, and patience, when it is guided by clarity, does not lose what belongs to it. It only waits for the right moment to reclaim it.